Hello, I am Madeline James, and today we are going to be having a really fun time interviewing Oliver Brackenbury and Jay Wolfe, who are the publisher and editor of an upcoming Sword Sorcery, Romantasy anthology collection. It's going to be called Beating Hearts and Battle Axes and is being published by Brackenbury Books. It's going to have 6 different novelettes, about 10,000 words, and it's going to be accessible via a Backerkit campaign, which is from June 20th to July 20th, and I have the link already down below for the sort of teaser page for this, where you can sign up to get notifications where it goes live, and then on June 20th it is going to be live, and I am very excited about it. If you watched my earlier interview where I interviewed Oliver for his Sword Sorcery magazine, we actually talked about this because one of the things I had brought up was that it just seemed so compatible with like romance and stuff like that, and he was like, well, actually we're gonna have an anthology, and so they're back again. And now we also have Jay, who is a fantastic editor, and I asked a ton of questions. This video is going to be split into 2 parts because it was quite a long chat. I had a lot to talk about and we just had a blast. This first part is going to include questions about the anthology specifically and putting it together and talking about the cover art and lots of cool stuff like that, and also some general publishing questions. And then in part 2, we are going to be talking about some questions about Romantasy and Sword Sorcery and their compatibility, not specifically about the anthology, just in general, and then asking some questions on behalf of some writers and aspiring authors to get some really good advice. And it's fantastic. There's some great information in there. Check out the chapters below where I'm going to have every single question sort of marked as a different chapter. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the stream. Okay, so we are here with Oliver Brackenbury and Jay Wolfe, and we're going to be talking about Beating Hearts and Battle Axes, which is really exciting. So do the two of you want to introduce yourselves real quick?
Sure thing. I'll go first. So yes, Oliver Brackenbury. I am the publisher of the being born with this book, Brackenbury Books. And coming off into that, I am the editor and publisher of New Age Sword and Sorcery magazine, which I was lucky enough to get to talk about on this channel in a previous video. Otherwise, yeah, I do my own writing, prose, and also some screenwriting as well. How about you, Jay?
Alrighty. I'm Jay Wolfe. I am an editor and micro publisher and artistic bon vivant of various fields and mediums. I publish books as Merritt Daniel McDowell, the first of which is in the current running self-publishing blog off. Shoot, and now I can't even remember the title of my own book. So having one of those kind of days. Yeah. Bringer of the Scourge is the title of the first book. Part of Song of the Scourge Lands.
Very cool. So for my viewers who aren't familiar with this project yet, which we did have a little bit of a hint in the last video where this got brought up, the, inevitable release of this, do you want to give a quick, elevator speech, kind of?
Yeah, but one of us is going to give it? I suppose
You
I
could
will.
both give
I
one,
think
and then we
Oliver has
can
a little more
vote on
practice
whose is
giving it
the
at this
best.
point.
Yeah, okay, so it's called Beating Hearts and Battle Axes. It's an anthology. It's the very first book from Brackenbury Books, from the people who brought you New Age Sword and Sorcery. It's going to be 6 novelette-length stories, so longer than we usually publish in the magazine, about 12,000 words a pop, 6 stories, 72,000 words. You know, it's not going to be like a phone book you can beat someone to death with, but it'll be a nice hearty read, and the stories are longer because we wanted to give room for people to, for our authors to get deeper into the relationships, because as the title suggests, it's us trying to bring in a lowercase r bit of romance into our stories, try and crank up a bit of the romance, a bit of the spice, in a genre that is, we'll get into this more, I'm sure, but it's been oddly chaste for the most part in its 100 years, despite having very, romantic, sexy art being kind of a defining feature. Anyway, we'll get into that more detail later. You can tell I'm still refining the pitch. This is the first interview. So, you're getting to enjoy this being polished in real time. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's us trying to sort of ride that romantasy zeitgeist by bringing in this unique fantasy subgenre that we really love, that is grounded very much in very human protagonists and usually smaller scale, more like personally motivated stories. So, if they're saving the world, it's like a happy side effect of them trying to get rich or like save their friend or something, and I've always really liked that about Sword and Sorcery, and we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, later. But I really felt that like this genre that's very much focused on smaller scale, more personal, more relatable characters, in my opinion, um, that has like so much sex appeal in its art, and yet again oddly chased through most of the actual writing, was really due a shot in the arm with some more romance and some more spice. And we could, that might be something that romantic people might get a kick out of, because they'll find novelty in like the weird and the sword and sorcery of it all. And the sword and sorcery fans will get a kick out of like, oh hey, like we don't immediately fade to black if someone says I love you, or we actually get to find out like why they love them, that kind of thing.
Right.
So yeah, like my hope is it'll be kind of like a best of both worlds. And to both readerships bring in elements that the other are kind of craving within their own domain.
I think it sounds really exciting. So my first set of questions are specifically about the anthology. So the next one was just the Backerkit teaser page, which all this is going to be linked below. I'll link the teaser page. I'll add a link below once the campaign's out and all of that. But the campaign, wow, I can talk today, doesn't launch for a few weeks as we're recording this. But are there any hooks from the individual stories that you can share yet?
I will leave that up to our glorious editor, which is Jay, of course.
So I tried to come up with sort of like the one line kind of tropey lines for each of my stories from my fabulous authors. Are we disclosing the names of our authors yet? I
would say throw them all out there, because we're doing the thing that we like to do in the run up to magazine crowdfunds of slowly revealing people. But I mean, this video, people aren't going to watch it necessarily the first day it comes out.
Right.
So I say
that was kind of what I was curious about.
Yeah. Tell people.
But then do we want any kind of order on them then?
At random, whatever works for your notes.
Random. So from Bryn Hammond, we have a delightfully queer theater troupe attracting the unwanted attention of an unknowable horror. From S.L. Huang, we have an outsider from another land dealing with the deep discomfort of attraction while also facing a dangerous enemy. Brent Hammond, we have a traveling pair of mercenaries who must make a fateful trip home to deal with wounds old and new. From David C. Smith, we have an evil sorcerer's designs on our romantic couple and their kingdom. I'm trying to think of a way to put that one. Driving, I guess, the core of the story. And from T.A. Marketan, we have a bandit on the run meets his ... matches in a pair of marauding mercenaries. Mm-hmm. And lastly, from Valerie Valdez, we have a mercenary swordswoman has to rescue her oldest nemesis, and the sparks fly.
Those are good. Okay.
I'm trying to keep them as vague as possible. Like there's none of these is like the whole story. Mm-hmm. All of these are very much like, here's a little amuse-bouche.
Yeah, just a little hint, just to
enough to be like, if you were scrolling through like Instagram and someone had an image with just like this phrase and like some hot art on it, like you would click, right? That's the idea.
Yeah.
That's sort of the like the crux of at least sort of like what I was aiming for our authors to be doing things that would kind of appeal to doing things that would appeal to an audience that's sort of outside of sword and sorcery, while still doing things that are recognizable to our friends who are avidly reading sword and sorcery and are looking for like new and exciting things in sword and sorcery, which is, I hesitate to say that that's like hard to do. I don't think that that's hard to do, but there's definitely like there's patterns that emerge in any kind of subgenre, and we're kind of playing with them.
Yeah,
we're doing
something very different. Cool.
Yeah, no, the alchemy of this whole thing has been very interesting. I mean, starting with picking the 6 authors, I said to Jay basically like, okay, we're going to sort of imagine this like, there's an aisle, and on one side there's all the sword sorcery people, on the other side there's like the rest of authors in general, Romantasy in particular, but just, like SFF and broadly speaking. So, I'll choose 3 and you choose 3, and, and so, yeah, anybody who reads New Age Sword and Sorcery will recognize two of those names. Bryn Hammond has been published in there before, and actually her story features a little more romantic and spicy take on Key and Dusmat, who are these like two fantasy Mongolian bandits that live on the periphery of things. And so you'll see them before in the magazine, but you'll get to see them a little differently in here, which I thought would be fun. Bryn was very excited when I said, "Yeah, you can get like a little deeper into their relationship." She's like, "Oh yeah, okay, good." While David C. Smith, like he is a veteran. He came up in the second wave of Sword and Sorcery in the '70s and early '80s, and he wrote. And I say this with love. Like I like that he brings this. He writes a very traditional kind of story, but he also is not shy about like the angle of the anthology. Like David's always a real pleasure to work with because he absolutely like knows what he's doing. He always teaches me new words, which is a hoot. The amount of times I've been editing, I'm like, "Is this?" And he's like, "Actually, if you look it up," I'm like, "Oh yeah, okay, you're right. That's a word. That's a word." Yeah, no, David's a pleasure to work with, and he writes thunderously fun stories. So yeah, like I've looked at his manuscript for this, and yeah. So yeah, and then everybody else in there, like Tia Marketing is sort of from like this SS scene. I read her another anthology called The Book of Blades, and I noticed that she had a real strength on like characterization and relationships, and just like it felt like her story was straining a little bit. Like she wanted to have a bit more spice, a bit more romance. So I was like, I think maybe when I reached out to her, she was like, yes, more. So meanwhile, Jay, I mean, why don't you tell a little bit about the three authors that you chose?
Okay. Well, so the first choice, of course, for me was Valerie Valdez because, first of all, I mean, Valerie's literally my best friend, and she more or less lives inside my head. So as soon as I was talking about doing this, it was sort of like, but the reason that I wanted to pull her in specifically is that she writes specifically on that borderline of romance and every other genre that she works with.
Mhm.
So and she's actually branching into mainstream romance on the like fantasy side next year. So I felt like it was a really good match to pull her on for this. And then Brent Lambert really wowed me with his book Unnecessary Chaos for Neon Hemlock.
Okay.
And he and I have been friends for a while, not like super close friends, but close enough that like I posted some Elric art and he liked it, and I was like, I see you there. And like we've had little conversations back and forth, and he had a story in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, which is a pretty like heroic fantasy kind of mag. So I knew that he could deliver what I wanted in terms of like the like bodily nature of sword and sorcery, the very necessary fighty elements of that, and also the weird elements of that, but also the romantic elements.
Right.
And
If I
then
if I can interrupt for 2
last but
seconds before
absolutely
you
not least, oh sorry.
if I can interrupt just before you move on, I just want to
Yeah.
say one of the great pleasures of bringing Jay in, aside from just like sharing the workload and so on, so I don't burn myself to the ground trying to do the magazine and the anthology simultaneously, is Jay. You remember I was on Blue Sky and I just saw like some guy I never heard of, Brent Lambert, being like, "Hey, if I do this in the story, is that sword and sorcery or is it more like epic fantasy or whatever?" And I just was like, "Well, actually, and I leaped in there. No, I was friendly about it, but I was like, "Hey, man, yeah, actually, I had this Sword Sorcery magazine. Here's my opinion on that. Blah blah blah." We got chatting back and forth, and I was like, "What a neat guy." Looked at his website. I was like, "Oh, he's written some neat stuff. Maybe we should consider him for the anthology." I messaged Jay, and Jay was literally like, "Yeah, I got him on board 20 minutes ago. What are you talking about?"
It was actually the
So
night before, but yeah.
the night before, but yeah, like, and you hadn't told me yet, so I mean, it was
so
perfect.
funny.
It just came together.
It was so funny, and I like as it was happening, I could do nothing to like stop it.
Yeah, because you saw the
Or like
conversation.
go in and
Yeah.
be like, guys, this is gonna work out really well, I promise you.
So yeah,
It
that
was
was
just
really
such
fun
like a
serendipity
just
there.
out
Anyway,
of
sorry.
nowhere, like this conversation just like just took off without me. But I was trying to play my cards really tight with all of my people, all of my authors, because I didn't want to like promise somebody and then have them like not deliver either. So I
Mhm.
had to have commitments from people before I would tell Oliver about them, just because I that's how I roll. So
Sure.
once I had heard from Brent, I went to bed and all of this transpired. And
First
because
thing
I
in the
keep
morning.
freelancer hours, this had all been going on like all morning. And I woke up to like, oh yeah, actually. And I mean, I got to look very smart for like a brief moment, but yeah, like I have prescient qualities, I guess. And then so I also put on SL Wong. I read and like I mean devoured, I have to say, The Water Outlaws, which I just thought was just like it's
a
such
good
a
one.
good retelling, and it's, I mean, like, the attention it's getting is completely deserved, absolutely mind-blowing, and the fact that SL was willing to work with me on it was just like, yes. Another person that I know in passing, socially, but I had not, like, it's hard to, like, approach people that are like, "Oh, yeah, like, no big, you're just award like, nominated for every award this season, like, what up? Hey, you wanna do a project for me?"
Right.
Um, but, the fact that, that I was able to make that happen was kinda like I'm so pleased, I'm so excited, and, I feel really confident that everybody is bringing something really unique to the table. And that's something that, I mean, part of why I have kind of, like, latched on like a little lamprey to New Edge Sword and Sorcery is just that Oliver
Make you
in
sound
particular,
involuntary.
and
Like I asked you.
I know, right?
Anyway,
Like,
carry on.
because it's like a mutual, like, I just, like, I feel like the reason that, the Discord, materialized in my inbox after the Kickstarter,
Last year,
and I
yeah.
never left. Um, but, yeah, no, just, like, the reason that I love New Edge so much, and I love the community that specifically has grown up around that magazine and around just everything that is being produced in that space so far, is just that, like, everybody's really looking for something that meshes this, like, long classic history of storytelling with stories that are a lot more nuanced, a lot more open-minded, stories that are definitely aimed at an audience that likes both of these things, because it's kind of hard to find that sometimes. And I feel really lucky that this community exists. So I'm hoping that I can do them a nominal amount of justice.
So my next question, and this is more of like, long-term question, because, the campaign hasn't even started yet. We're almost a month out from that still. But once the campaign ends, is the anthology going to be available, like, outside of that? Because I know you're selling paperbacks and hardcovers and ebooks, I think, through the campaign.
Yeah, doing all three formats. Yeah, digital soft cover in like mass market paperback size, like classical paperback. I love that so much. And then yeah, like a slightly larger hardcover for people who dig the more sturdy, luxurious format. Yeah, so this one, yeah, we're doing Amazon. So
Okay.
basically, at some point, I don't want to make any promises about the timeline right now. It's a bit too soon for that. But at some point, quite a bit later, and certainly after backers have gotten their books, that is my promise.
Yeah.
I know it's a bummer to back something and be like, it's on Amazon and I haven't got my copy yet, or whatever. Like, no. Until we've at least shipped them out and a bit of time has passed, whenever that comes exactly. But before the year is over, I should hope. As we, Jay is saying, like, we have drafts of all the stories. We're in the middle of editing now, and the crowdfund doesn't even launch until June 20th. It ends
Right.
July 20th. So I'm feeling relatively confident that, like, one of the things the crowdfund pays for is copy editing, proofing, whatever. So like that'll happen still after the campaign. But yeah, we're going to get this long before Christmas, whatever, and I'll give a better estimate when we get closer to that. But yes, it will be available, on Amazon, the usual way. So yeah, and hopefully some stores. I'm going to try and get into some shops. I've got a few contacts I want to explore for that, because it's just nice to get things from local stores and support them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah. No, it'll be well available, and we've got a bunch of little bonuses and extras and things like that for the crowdfund to entice people to get in on it early. Plus, there's just like the overall fun of the fact that, like, I always try to come up with something. It's not you can't always do it, but for when I do a crowdfund, I try to come up with some sort of like meta goal. So like when we did the magazine earlier this year, it was like, hey, if you back this, you're going to get issues of a cool magazine with all kinds of cool stuff in it. But
Mhm.
also, you legit had a chance to be a part of history by helping revive Jarella Jory, this famous character. Hadn't been around in 85 years, but still lots of people read her. And she got her first news story. Well, is getting it a little this year. We're still working on it. But yeah, in 85 years. So like that's kind of cool. That's helping like create a little event in literary, genre history. And so in this case, like maybe it's not quite as grand as that, but I still think it's kind of cool that you, by getting this book, are going to help get this like new publisher off the ground. Because that's what and any of our funds over like our few stretch goals are going to basically go to like towards like paying for a logo and like giving us a bit of money to invest in like art for the next book and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So yeah, people who enjoy helping get like a new venture off the ground maybe will also get that out of this crowdfund. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be great. And we'll have to link once it's all out. I mean, I'll be linking the campaign stuff as it gets released because, people want that. But speaking of, the books and all that, I'm going to put the cover art somewhere on the screen here so that everyone can see it. And it is so cool. It is very fantastic. It has the vibes of both, I think, which is really fun. And the cover artist is M.E. Morgan. And there are definitely like a lot of differences, right, in the trends between Romantasy and Sword and Sorcery cover art.
Yes.
So what can you say about like the approach for the cover design?
Oh gosh.
Well, okay. I will say
we had
first of
some
all,
we had some production meetings on this one.
yeah, no, but it was fun. It was just interesting because, like
Oh,
I
it was
say, like
great.
this, like with the writing, like with pitching, like with so much of this, it's just kind of like I don't know if tightrope is the right word for it because that sounds very dangerous, and that's not that dangerous. But it's like we're just sitting there with a giant dial that's got Romantasy on one end and SNS on the other, and just kind of being like back and forth.
Yep.
Certainly, one thing I'm really happy with is due to the success of the magazine crowdfund, we were able to have additional money to then invest in this cover, so it's a full wraparound, front
Yes.
and back, which was very
Mm.
pleasing. And that meant that we could invest in kind of creating like two scenes. I thought was the way to go because you can't show everything. We want to get a bit more variety, especially a book that's featured on focused on relationships, right?
Right.
And the fact that it does carry forward sort of our love of inclusivity, that we bring from the magazine. So it's like, okay, we want to show maybe more than one kind of relationship. And if you only had a front cover, that'd be tricky without making it just like, I don't know, an orgy. Like, how do you get like, 12 couples or whatever and one on the front that make any sense other than like a speed dating and sword sorcery meeting? I don't know.
I
Like,
think
how do you
it
do
would
this, right?
yeah, it would scale out. It would scale out really weird too because like when you think of sword and sorcery, like yeah, you think of maybe like an adventuring duo or an adventuring trio or something, but you start to have like multiple couples and it's like, what's happening here?
Yeah,
Like
it's just like
this
there was
is
a
like
theme party and then all of a sudden a monster. Like, I don't know.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You get your level 12
Actually, now I say
cast
that.
lightning or whatever, and it's just no
Yeah.
fun anymore.
So, so I was really glad to be able to, ask Emmy to do essentially a kind of like sort of more wilderness, barbarian kind of situation on the front, and on the back we've got an more urban fantasy SMS kind of like heist with a couple of classic thieves in the vein of Clafford and Grey Mouser. So that was very pleasing that we could have a couple of scenes. And then, yeah, Jay, you usually remember these things better than I do. Do you remember when I first talked to you about this? Like, what on earth did I say was our goal precisely? I remember there was a lot of talk of like, we want to make sure that there's a lot going on in the eyes. We want to make sure that like people
Yeah.
see the way the characters are looking at each other and they know like they're in love or they're having a meet cute or like they're going to do something later. We
Yeah.
really the eyes were a big
Well,
part of the
I
body
mean,
language.
we really wanted it to be very bodily, like again, like the classic covers of Sword and Sorcery, like Earl Norm kind of stuff. Very, like leaning a little bit away from the Frazetta or like, forgive me, Oliver, I'm about to out you for this one again. Julie Bell's husband,
Ah,
who
yeah,
is
right.
Boris Vallejo. We were in the middle of a meeting, and I mean, to be fair, like Oliver was so sleepless at this point, like the dog had kept him like so awake. But we were having our this was like our very first production meeting for the cover, and we were still at a point like we had only very barely hashed out like who we wanted as an illustrator for it. And so like we were coming up with just as many things as we could throw at it that were like, here's what we do want, and like trying not to I tried not to give her too many like don'ts, because I feel like when you give illustrators don'ts, they start to go like, but why?
Mm.
Whereas if you go like, here are the things we do want, and but yeah, so yeah. Yeah, poor sleepless Oliver is like, not what's his name, Julie Bell's husband.
Well,
And I was like, no, I completely agree. That's definitely what I don't want. We do not want gore covers. We
oh
really,
dear.
really wanted it to
But to
be
what we
like,
did want, yeah,
yeah, we really wanted it to be like obvious that they were like either a couple or attracted. Like we wanted to have like the meet cute in the eyes, or like the like. I love that everybody I've shown that cover to so far is like, they're gonna fuck, right? Sorry, I mean, I'm
that's
pardoning my
fine.
French, but like everyone that I've shown that cover to is like, wait, all right, I see what's going on here immediately. And so like that has been that was our goal. That was what we set out to do. And so that is one of the great pleasures of art directing someone, is being able to like evoke that thing. And
I think
honestly, that
yeah, right?
it,
Like the posing,
as
we were like,
yeah.
how close are they going to be together? How so back to back? How does that go? And yeah, you mentioned the Earl Norham, who's a great artist. If anybody wants to look him up and hasn't heard of him before, spelled like it sounds. he was very prolific, but his main thing I knew him from was Savage Sword of Conan, the classic like magazine format comic from like
Yep.
the 70s and 80s. And he just has all these amazing covers. I must have run like a dozen by Jay, and then Jay, we must have shown at least half a dozen of those, I think, to me.
Yes.
And it just was this thing of like it was a very like more so than the back cover. I felt it was a very literal expression of what we were doing, which is just taking classic Sword and Sorcery and going, okay, how do we tweak this? How do we take like
Mhm.
a norm cover where the guy standing and the woman's hanging off his leg, or the guy and the woman are both like kind of facing in general towards the viewer, and just make it a little more equal, a little more relationshipy,
Mhm.
you know. And I really feel like Emmy nailed it. You know, it was great. Um, Another one that definitely was harder, and this is not on Emmy, this is on Jay and I being like, I was figuring out the back cover. The back
Mhm.
cover with the two fellows who, like, I was like, yeah, we have a meet cute and like two thieves, and they both reached for the same thing. Like if Indiana Jones was opening, you know, with the golden thing on the plinth, and another Indiana Jones who was also quite hot, and they both went and grabbed the thing at the same time, and then looked up like, who's grabbing that treasure? Oh, you know,
Oh
how
yeah.
do we capture that energy? And it was surprisingly tricky.
It
Like,
was. It was. But that was yeah, that was definitely on us. But also like when we originally approached that, we were just like I think we were so stuck for ideas at that point that it was just sort of like I'm going to throw this ball to the illustrator and see what they come up with in the sketch. And then we just kind of like refined it and refined it and refined it back and forth. And honestly, she was such a gem to work with on that. It was absolutely wonderful. And she honestly brought a lot to those characters to the point where I'm like, every time I look at the back cover in particular, I'm like, I want to write that book.
it does invite a story, yeah, because it feels
it,
so much like an opening
it
to
is,
something. You want to know what
there is
happens
absolutely
next.
like, there are story hooks in both of those covers now that I think like I've wanted the covers specifically to be telling a story of its own rather than like a story that's inside the anthology. As tempting as it is to be like, oh yes, these stories should be inside the anthology specifically. Um I wanted it to be a little bit more inviting and more like suggestive of the content rather
Mhm.
than like specific to the content because
Right.
I felt like that would be prioritizing like one author over another and I didn't think that would be fair for a project like this one in
Mhm.
Plus, we
particular.
still hadn't gotten all the manuscripts in, right?
Right,
So
at
then
that
it's
point,
like,
well,
"Oh, we'll
honestly,
just reward the first
at the
draft
point we
again."
were doing the cover meeting, I definitely had not solidified at least 2 people.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh
So,
gosh.
But that's
it
okay
was
'cause
definitely
I
like I was pulling on roughly 4 threads at the same time during
Mhm.
that period. It was definitely kinda wild.
Yeah, no, I guess it's fair to say we've been kind of ambitious in trying to like build this plane while flying it, so to speak. But I felt like, you know, I agree with everything Jay said, and I also felt like for the very first volume, certainly, you just want to kind of evoke the idea. Like that's what we're trying to get everybody
Right.
into. You know, we don't want
Mhm.
to get too specific to any one specific author's story or whatever. And of course, the funny thing is, you say you and I were both kind of like about ideas when we were doing the back, but by the time we got to the point where this cover's subject matter was settled, it's happening, we're just tweaking an eyebrow here or whatever. I woke up with like 95 ideas for, I guess, a volume two we'll have to do. Like,
Yeah.
I really, like, and yeah, I
Yeah.
remember some of the stuff I ran by you. I don't want to spoil any of it, but
Yeah.
I don't know what it was. I just woke up and had all these fun ideas, and you bounced off of me, and we came up with all kinds of great stuff.
Well,
So nothing's
I mean
confirmed, but if this anthology succeeds enough and people like it, and yada yada yada, maybe we'll have a volume two next year. And for that volume, I would definitely be willing to look at open submissions because I know people already have been asking me like, "Oh, hey, do you have all the stories for this anthology?" I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, this one's covered. Sorry." We
yeah.
Yeah.
did commissions, much like I did with the magazine. You know, just to like have a bit more control over the project and be able to get out a little quicker. You know, plus I'll
Yeah.
be honest, I find slush piles intimidating, though I recently have gotten a little over that, which is nice. And so, yeah, my hope is that this anthology will come out, people will love it, but also people who go, "Oh, I'd love to write something like that," can read it and get an idea of what we're looking for. And maybe we'll do a volume two next year with open subs. But I get ahead of myself because publishing moves very slowly, and you have to think well ahead. Pardon
Mhm.
me. Back to the present. Sorry, Jay. You were saying.
If nothing else, it gives her a brass ring for other projects, right? Like the
Yeah.
existence of one project proves a viability.
Mhm.
And so like that was part of what we were aiming for. It was very funny though when Oliver sort of like learned how like certain types of romantasy art works because that like that part I don't think clicked in the first meeting that we had, but like after we got sketches back from Emmy and we started to do like the paint in and stuff, like that part, like all of a sudden it started to click and it was like, oh yeah, all right, yeah, the like okay, yeah, we've got the right energy on the front cover. Now we have to do that on the back, like and it was like we're talking like refinements of like exactly like he was saying, like where is the eyebrow? like like what is the expression that is being conveyed here? We need to
If you
get
look
like
closely, one of the guys is
elegant
biting his
things to
lip,
say.
and we were like, "But which side?"
Yes, we did. We
That is
actually did go
important.
back and forth about that.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah,
Like,
it's why
yeah,
not, right? Like, I
we have
mean,
fun. We have fun.
yeah. But yeah, I'd like to think we bring that level of detail and attention to the interior as well. Obviously, I'm thinking of the words, which I'll let Jay cover more. But also, I'm referring to the fact that we will have at least one interior illustration by Trevor Nguyen, which will be kind of like a full page black and white, like gateway to the stories illustration. But car salesman kicks in. If we hit one of our stretch goals, we'll get sextuple illustrations. Yes, sextuple. And that means, of course, one illustration for every story, all by Trevor. Trevor's a really talented artist, work coming out of South Africa, and well, I've given you some samples of his work. You can throw up on the screen if you want. And
Yeah,
folks, you can
I'll put the
also,
samples up.
yeah, and
Yeah.
folks, you can also see illustrations of his in many places. He's just launched a comic, actually, but including issue 1 of New Age Sword Sorcery. He illustrated a story by Sarah Macklin, and we've got him back for this year with issues 3 and 4, I think 4. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So that's kind of fun. I always think it's nice to have at least one little illustration on the inside. I don't know. I just love that when you open a book and you get something on top.
That's a classic pulpy thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's also exactly in the vein of what we're doing, So yeah.
Yeah, I'm hoping there's all 6 illustrations we'll see though. I really like illustrations, especially when it comes to shorter fiction. I just think it kind of helps fill in a lot of the blanks and the imagination, and like doesn't even necessarily, like I've seen ones where it doesn't show exactly everything that's in the story as it happens in the story, but it lets your mind wander on like everything else that, could be going on or happen after or happen before, because you don't have quite as many pages, and I always love them for that.
Plus, there's always the fun of like comparing what you imagine to what you get shown, partway through the story or whatever. Like, I don't know, I never get tired of that. Yeah. No, art's just fun to have in a book. Yeah.
Yeah. So my next question is, where did the idea come from to combine sword and sorcery and, romance or romantasy?
Okay, so that was me, and Jay remembered this better than me. Jay, was it last April? I think I messaged you about this. Remember what I said? This stuff burns, slowly, right?
Yeah.
But I
Although
think it was last.
initially, it was April. We had first started chatting about it, and then initially you had approached me like, would you be interested in doing a special issue of the magazine? And
Right,
eventually
this
it
started off as
morphed.
a special magazine
It was a
issue.
special. Yeah, I actually had to go look this up because we've been having this conversation a lot.
Yeah.
This has come up in every single conversation we've had about it so far. Is like, wait, when did this happen? And it's like, this has been a year in progress. Like, publishing is really slow.
Yeah.
But yeah, so so in April you had approached me about it as possibly a special issue, and
Of
by
New Age
July
Sword.
I think it had morphed into like,
An
maybe
anthology,
we should do this as
yeah.
an anthology. And I mean, like, that actually was definitely, that was a little bit more sensible to me, just because like, when it comes to a magazine that there's only like 2 issues a year, a special issue is like that's gonna soak a lot of damage on your
Your
bottom
budget and
line
stuff,
to
yeah.
begin
Or
with.
even if you do like an extra
And
one, that's so much more to raise. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, like,
I'll just say
the
this. Okay,
transition
so
from 2 issues to 3 would still be a lot.
yeah, like
So making
I'll
it a
just say
separate
it's just.
project made a lot more sense.
Yeah, it started off as me being ambitious and wanting to do very special themed issues in New Age Sword and Sorcery, and then realizing, like, frankly, just economically, that was extremely ambitious. But also, like, I wanted to try, getting a book out there. I mean, at the end of the day, I love magazines, obviously, but way more people like to read books, and so I just thought, okay, well, let's try that. And then I thought, okay, of all the anthologies I was looking at, a whole bunch of ideas I don't want to give away, but the romance one really grabbed me, and I keep saying romance, and a little like sweat bead appears above my head because I know there's capital R romance and there's lower R romance, lowercase
Yeah.
romance, and I'm forever talking about lowercase r. Not that we don't have any happily ever afters, but like I am very well aware that capital R romance has extremely strict rules for like what can happen in the story, and I mean, it's not quite they must kiss on page 2, not 3, but like I get it, and I totally respect that the people who love it have very strict expectations based around those.
Yeah.
So I don't want to mislead anybody. You're not going to come into this getting like a Harlequin model of romance. But what you will get, I hope, is kind of what I was finding myself wanting, which was, I had spent the last, 7 years or whatever, just reading as much Sword and Sorcery as I could get my hands on, first for my own writing and then for, the magazine and all that kind of thing. And I found as I worked back through the classics, for all the way back from, just stuff from a few years ago all the way through to Conan, Robert E. Howard, right at the beginning of it all. I was always left wanting more, and not just in that way of like, oh, I want to read more of the story. It was kind of like, oh, I really wish like what was her
Yeah.
deal? You know, what was his deal? Why did they fall in love exactly? Or was it just because they needed to have a love interest in the story? You know, and I mean, I don't want to poo-poo anything. Like it's just like different priorities, right? You
Right.
know, the people, but like sometimes it was as if the author was getting almost there, and then would kind of like not quite go all the way. And my example, I always make it sound like I've only read one Conan story. I've read all of them, but my personal favorite, People of the Black Circle. I swear to God, I brought this up last video. Well, I'll just, without going into too much detail, it's a great story. I highly recommend everybody, you know, watching this, check it out. And it's the closest I felt to, some people would argue Queen of the Black Coast is more romantic, but anyway, to me, it's the most romantic story, or most romance like fueled story that he wrote for Conan, where basically it's all about him and a princess getting caught up with each other. They hate each other, then they like each other, and then along the way they're torn because you know they each have responsibilities to like him and his war band and her nation. And at the end, it's like, do they abandon their obligations or do they run off together? Who knows, right? I won't spoil the ending for admittedly a very old story. But you know, this Conan and this woman Yasmina, the Devi Yasmina, the word princess in that story. I just at the end of it was like, oh, like I love them both so much, and I want them to have more time to like have a relationship between all the monsters and the fighting, and I want to see them together more. And then I learned to my delight, I'm not even not only I assumed I wasn't the only person who felt this way, but I know for sure I'm not because Lynn Carter and an author named Bjorn Nyberg, when they kind of like revived Conan in the 60s and 70s, they did their own basically like fan fiction situation where there was a whole Conan novel, and then for reasons I won't get into, it's too much for here. In the middle of the book, Yasmina shows up. And her and Conan have like a night of passion, and then like she's like, "Well, anyway, bye." Back to the main story. Like, it was so like a fanboy. Like, I just want to tick this box, like you know. And I was like, I feel you so hard. And I just thought about that, and I thought about how, like I say, you go back through the canon. Of course, there's exceptions. Like Tanith Lee is an author who is very not, you know, chaste and not averse to romance and sexuality. In her Sword and Sorcery, her Birth Grade books in particular, I recommend. But on average, it is funny that you read these stories, and yeah, like I say, like the love interests tend to not be well developed, but even if they are, like the romance is just kind of like they meet and they fall in love because that's what they're doing. Like you don't get a lot of emotional depth, I find, to it. And yeah, the approach to sexuality tends to be either extremely like fade to black. I guess they had sex, maybe hard to say, or once in a while it kind of just gets. I don't know. I find it on the other end it can be very, very juvenile, very deep, and like stuff that's sometimes even a little gross to read. Like, I don't know what it is. I just haven't found a lot in the way of like mature, in-depth sexuality and romance in the Sword and Sorcery canon, going back over the last, you know, nearly 100 years. So I thought, okay, and then what there is, I always want more, right? Like that People of the Black Circle. So I thought, well,
Yeah.
the joy of being a publisher, if you want more of something, you know, I wanted more Charlotte Cherie stories. Haha, I'm bringing one into the world. Hey, I want more like romance and like spicy, like, you know, elements mixed into the steaming vat of Sword and Sorcery. All right, let's do this anthology. You know, somewhere along the line, I thought of the title, which I won't deny, I kind of enjoy in small part because it has the same amount of syllables as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and you can say it to that tune, which may have had some slight influence on the design of the logo type, the title. I don't know, that just happened. But anyway, it's okay. We're all
We're both
creations
children of the
of
'80s. It was inevitable.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
Um, and so for me, like, I do want to jump on this just
for
because
sure.
this is one of those things that we do talk about a lot when we get into these things, because I came to Sword and Sorcery from the opposite end.
Mhm.
I came to Sword and Sorcery from like Elric, and really like my most barbarian stuff would be like Wendy and Richard Peeny's Elf Quest, which as a comic is absolutely Sword and Sorcery stuff, even if it's got like little bits of things that Oliver would probably flinch at. But the thing is that both of those are elements of Sword and Sorcery that carry a lot of romance with them.
Mhm.
And so like to me, that's a natural thing in this genre. And so like to sort of piggyback on that, like it's not like it was never present in the genre. It's just sort of like a thing that got danced around a lot, and you wonder how much of it was like editorial taste too,
Mhm.
just because like there were definitely periods of time where it was just like you just didn't publish a short story that also had boning in it. Like it just didn't really happen that way. And because newsstands were a lot pickier about stuff.
Yeah.
But so as far as that stuff goes, like there's like a natural inclination to that type of like relationship story in Sword and
Mhm.
Sorcery, but it was definitely something that like a lot of people either like aren't interested in, or maybe they don't feel comfortable with it, or like for whatever reason it just like is a thing that a lot of people that I know sort of lament its absence or like want more of it, and that's sort of what we're here to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. Like, it's definitely something where, I mean, when we were talking about it, I was like, it feels like
It feels very
this is
natural.
a
It feels like
thing. Like,
everybody that I have mentioned it to so far has been like, "Oh yeah." And also been like, "Okay, yeah, I can see exactly why you're working on that."
Yeah, and just like I
Right.
say, it's so funny given the contrast between like in the writing where there wasn't a lot of it and where it felt like they were pushing against limits, right? Maybe
Right.
editorial,
The
right?
wheres and the
Uh,
whens is definitely like a big part of that question, I think.
yeah, yeah. And then meanwhile, the art from Frazetta in the 60s onward,
Right.
was
Yeah, the art
extremely
definitely
like barely
says
wearing loincloths, covered in baby oil, all that stuff. And so you're just kind of like, how you see that on the cover and read inside and it just it'd be completely not that so
Mhm.
yeah it's we just thought, okay, let's bring it all together here. And yeah, I honestly, like, my big feeling is you can have mature relationships and approaches to sexuality and still have the weird beasties and the weird sorcery and all that
Yep.
good stuff. Like, I don't think it's an either or, like so much of what I've been doing since I started the magazine. I just figure, like, why not have the cake and eat it?
Yeah.
So yeah.
I feel like it's a big bonus of this particular project.
Yeah, and so as publishing goes, it just by last July we settled on we were like, okay, yeah, an anthology, and then just had to kind of wait and think about it until early this year because other things had to get done. And then it was
Yep.
around January where I said to you about talking about figuring out authors and the timeline, and then the
Yep.
magazine crowdfunded gangbusters, hurrah, 200% of our goal pretty much, and that wrapped early March. At which point I sort of metaphorically turned to Jay and went, "All right, now we're
So
gonna get
time.
serious. Like all the conversations and fun times are now like we gotta
Yep.
make this thing happen." So
Mhm.
yeah, we've been kind of furiously working away at it ever since. And now, yeah, all the stories are in. I've read all but two, and we've been really enjoying what we've read so far. Jay's read all of them, of course.
Yep.
And the hope is to have them. We'll see what happens, but the hope is to have them. Otherwise, beyond proofreading, edited by the time the crowdfund launches, or certainly by the time it's over, which is the more important goal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So July 20th, and then yeah, hopefully hopefully we will fund. We will fund, and
Yeah,
then
I
we'll use
mean,
those.
come on.
Then we'll use those funds amongst other things for covering the proofreading and
We'll
production
just
and all that good stuff, and get out to people. I mean, because we are doing the Amazon POD thing, that does mean a much quicker printing and proofing process. So maybe
yeah.
September. We'll see. I certainly think before Christmas. I can see Jay sweating already. So let's say
Yeah,
October.
I was gonna say, as soon as you start to like introduce a timeline of like, oh, this object will be finished, I'm gonna be
Yeah.
like, okay.
I'll say
Yeah,
this
no,
though. Certainly, I think for the average crowdfund, it will be quite quick. Whatever the exact
yeah,
Mhm.
timeline, it will
yeah.
be
This
quite
isn't
quick.
gonna be like a December 2025 situation.
No,
Right.
no.
That's good.
2024, and probably not December 2024 either. Like
No,
I would be
I'm
surprised if it took that
hopeful. I'm
long.
hopeful that this is a thing that we can like have people like recommending to their friends by Christmas. Like
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
this
Especially because
is
yeah, like I say, the cover art's already done. People can see that,
yeah,
Yeah, like we're trying to get as much done as humanly possible without killing ourselves before the crowdfund. I just
yeah,
think as much as you can, that's always the goal to aim for. Is if you have faith in the project, and we really do. We really think that this has good crossover potential, and people. We
yeah,
hope in the romantasy sphere and beyond. I mean, just people in general, will get a kick out of it.
Yeah, I think it'll be good. Speaking about, we've talked about the spice levels a little bit. I'm curious, how spicy is it going to be? Because I'm sure it varies per story, but
it
I'm gonna
does.
make fun of myself, and then I'll shut up, and Jay, you get the full answer. I'm just gonna make fun of myself in that I literally just Googled, because I knew this would come up, and I knew the term spice level, obviously, and I just was like, "Well, what is spice levels? What is the universal meter of spice levels?" And I got,
there's
like,
like tiers with chili peppers and
yeah. I
Yeah,
got like 4 or 5 different scales from blogs going back 1 minute to 20 years, and I just was, like, going across them all and being like, and then I eventually just, like, ran a couple by Jay, and then eventually we were like, "Alright, this scale seems the best one," and I can't remember what it was called anymore, unfortunately. You and I just kinda, like, grabbed the text of the level that we liked out of that and then put it in a guide
yeah,
I wrote for the authors so they would know what the heck they can work with.
yeah,
It was, like,
Mhm.
near the high end. It was, like, 'cause there was, like, I think it was, like, 1 to 5, and 5 was, like, straight up erotica, so we were like,
Mhm.
yeah.
"Eh,
We wanted to make sure
3
we
to
still had
4?"
stories. We
Yeah.
didn't
Yeah.
really plot. We wanted stories.
Yeah.
So that was sort of like so the range was like 1 to 4.
Oh, was it okay?
Um, the reality is that so I have stories that are gonna range from pretty much like sweet longing to like absolutely action on page kind of situation with
Mhm.
delicate, nice language generally.
Nice,
We
nice.
have
A
to
good variety is
refine.
good.
I mean, like, I don't want to out anybody or anything. Like, there's a range. There's a range of stuff.
Mhm.
I feel like any reader who is looking for a combination of stories that have romantic elements and swords and sorcery, they're gonna be happy with this. Like,
Yeah.
there's um it's kind of interesting how it's shaken out. We do have some overtly queer content, which I'm really, really excited about.
Yeah.
But we also have just like we have some polyamory, we have some just like a wide variety of storytelling relationship mixtures. And I feel like it's neat to have a little bit of everything. That's sort of the point of an anthology. And
Mhm.
so I'm hopeful that having kind of like such a smorgasbord of just like overall elements that are going to be
Mhm.
different. I think that that will I mean, honestly, what I'm hoping is that it'll spawn a bunch of people going like, I want to write something like that, and either, making their own thing, or like
Submit to volume
just
two.
reaching out with my
Yeah.
poems. uh yeah, like I didn't really have like any specific objectives for the specific types of relationships, other than that they be interesting to read about, and that they would be as interesting to read about as any other element of a sword and sorcery story.
Mhm.
That was sort of like the waterline, so to speak.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, I chose to write like a one page, just like what is this thing, kind of
Yeah.
guide for our authors because we felt like something you could easily go off in one direction or another that might be a little off the off the reservation, so to speak. And so with the spice levels, like after Jay and I were like, okay, around here, that feels good.
Yeah.
I made a point of putting in the guide. I was like, here's a thing, link to this like 20-year-old blog or whatever it was I found. Let's see if you want to read that precise description. But my thing I pushed was like we're not gonna set like a minimum or a like a mandatory like thing. This
Right.
for me it was like about giving permission as far as the spice goes, but the mandatory thing was like, well, it can't the romance has to be like a through line of the story. It cannot be
Mhm.
incidental. It has to be a
Right.
story where if you pull the romance out, it would be like it wouldn't make sense or be much weaker because otherwise it's not for this anthology. The whole point,
Yeah.
right?
Right,
So
right.
that was the mandatory thing. The spice was like, here's like the boundaries, have fun within them. That's all we
Right.
ask. Yeah, and went pretty broad. I felt that was important for me because, yeah, like I was other than just making sure we still have a story, we don't have the SMS, how do I pay for this pizza situation. I really how do I put this? Like, I just like to respect the reader, and I think part of that comes with just having broad boundaries for sexuality. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that we are on the absolute same page about. So that made this very easy to kind of like develop this project.
Mhm.
And in a funny way, that did kind of make it me think again of the classic stuff. I mean, not just SMS, but SFF in general. I remember being a kid in like the late '80s, early '90s, and I'd find my friends' dad's collections of like Asimov and other like classic magazines from the '60s and '70s. And every single one of those things, like one story would surprise the hell out of you with like really explicit sexual content, and the next one's like, "What if a robot could think?" And you're like, "I don't know. I'm still worried about that last story. I was not expecting that." Uh, you know, and it didn't ruin me or turn me into too much of a degenerate. So I feel like why not have that in this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tying off of the whole like talking about the romantic through line, right? Because that's obviously there. Is there anything else from the, point of like themes or anything in the story that kind of also ties it together? Or is it just that importance of those romantic relationships and the connections and all of that that's through all of the stories?
Oh, that's a good question. So, as far as I'm concerned, so like if in general our romances are A plot, we still wanted a really strong B plot.
Hmm.
And in general, I feel like there's enough of a variety of like what we would consider to be like a strong plot in a sword and sorcery story, that we ended up with a pretty wide variety in that regard, I think.
Hmm.
There will be some topics and themes that I think will repeat in interesting ways, just because
Hmm.
there are sort of like stock elements in sword and sorcery that I think, like, sometimes they're just sort of like the themes of the outsider, or like the kind of I'm trying to think of a good way to put it, like the idea that like magic or sorcery or whatever weird, and we're using like WYRD weird in
Yeah.
there, like whatever thing is there is sort of innately unknowable, like very just eldritch, so to speak, and that sort of thing. But also like there are I feel like the interesting thing with that is that those also lend interesting kind of colors to relationship stories.
Yeah.
Like part of why these are so compelling to me just in general, like a lot of the stories that I write, whether they're like sword and sorcery or grimdark or sort of like I would say most of my stuff is sort of in some kind of heroic fantasy mode, but in terms of that, like the layering of romance on top of that is just something that I always kind of like, it just sort of happens like whether I want it to or not. And so
Mhm.
that was actually sort of, I think, part of why Oliver approached me for this was an early writing sample I sent him was just like absolutely soaked with this kind of stuff. And he was like, oh, hey, all right, well, you're clearly like familiar with that terrain. So, and yeah, so that was sort of the genesis of the conversation that about this that got us here in the first place, was just sort of like that's just like the framework that I view a lot of the stories that I write. And
Mhm.
so it evolved very naturally in the sense of like the conversation about what the project should be or shouldn't be. And I think that to our author's great credit, that they haven't had to sit in on any of these conversations, and they've still knocked it out of the park for what we were looking for.
Yeah.
And that is really, I'm very I'm very pleased and excited about that part.
Yeah,
It
and like
proves that
as a
there's an interest in it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and like as publisher, I didn't really want to. I felt it was already going to be pretty specific in the sense that sword and sorcery as a specific subgenre, like we talked about in the last interview,
Mhm.
is for a lot of people it's still a broad catch-all term for just fantasy. So to be
Right.
asking the authors to
Mhm.
work within a much more specific definition of fantasy, this subgenre, and I
Mhm.
know I myself am even within sword and sorcery people apparently a little picky for some. I felt like
We
if we
just
got
come from different modes. It's
yeah,
fine.
I know, I'm just teasing. But, if I figure if that's the case already, and then we're going
Yeah.
also thread romance into it, but not big R, little r,
Yeah.
watch the
Yeah,
size of the
really
R.
specific view of
Uh,
romance that
yeah,
is not category romance.
yeah,
Right,
so
right.
if we're already, like, doing that, right, I felt like that was asking enough of the authors, and I hoped would bring enough specificity to intrigue the readers. If we wanted to have 7 sword and sorcery romance, I don't know, heist stories, I mean, heck, there's something, I don't know, maybe I say these things to be silly, and then I'm like, "What if we did that?" So, okay, but this time
This
we're
is
not
how
doing
I
that.
this
do like
this
the
is how
heist.
this starts. This is how this
Yeah,
starts.
yeah, yeah.
So I have so before we move past this section specifically about the anthology, was there anything else that you wanted to like talk about specifically about the anthology or the project specifically to share?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I could get into, like, crowdfund stuff, but I think that's maybe coming up.
I mean,
So
oh,
to
I'll
I
let you
feel like
go
we
first.
covered a lot. I mean, we talked I think we covered the
It's your
art,
publishing
stories,
company.
authors, themes, genre. Yeah, I don't know. How about you, Jay? I feel pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, like, really what I'm excited about and hopeful for is, like, that the reaction that I've gotten so far from everybody that I've told this project about, or, like, everybody I've shared the art with has been like, "Oh, yeah." So, like, I feel like it's a jumping off point. I don't feel like it's like, "Oh, this is gonna be the pinnacle of Romantasy or the pinnacle of Sword and Sorcery." Like, this is very much like this is very much like new terrain, and I'm hoping that this inspires other people to keep pushing that terrain. I
Yeah.
don't by any means think that this is like a one and done situation personally, because just based on the reactions that I'm getting.
Mhm.
But I'm also like I'm hopeful for and excited about the fact that other people are hopeful and excited. Like
Yeah.
Yeah, I will say that's one thing that really helped keep me going, even before you and I, Jay and I, started going on this more seriously after the crowdfund for the magazine. Just me just flitting it by people. I can't help myself. I always have to like run premises by people over the
oh
months.
yeah.
That helps me let off steam, you know. And always, 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 I never got even a remotely like C plus reaction. It was always just like do it. So I I
Yeah.
hope people
Yeah.
do that to the crowdfund with their money and afterwards with sales for sure. Sorry, publishers, got to say that, but
Oh
also, yeah, Jay,
absolutely.
I agree with you. I hope that we can sort of again, not that we're the first ones to ever do it, but certainly the first ones to do it in such quantity. I think in such condensed, intentional fashion
Yeah.
that I'm aware of, anyway. And yeah, yeah, I hope we can inspire others to play in the sandbox too, and to come back to us with submissions for
It's
writing
it's
more.
like putting a stamp on a thing that I'm forgetting exactly. I want to say it was Stephen Bruce. One of the lectures I sat in on, basically there's an idea in science fiction and fantasy in general that there's a long conversation. We're all in conversation with the writers that we loved and that inspired us, and then there are going to be authors who are inspired by us, presumably, that would also carry on that conversation after us. And to be part of the long conversation in this particular direction is very like intriguing and exciting, and I hope it has as much steam as I think it does.
Yeah. That's a really cool way of thinking about it. I hadn't heard that phrase before, but I really like that.
It's so helpful. Like it helped me like reframe all of my thoughts about like what inspires me and what things I'm trying to bring out of my like own bookshelf and sort of like throw at my keyboard. and and I think it's a helpful framework for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a couple of publishing questions. I will get into a few more later from like there's like a questions from the writer's perspective.
No worries.
Perspective. Wow. Some of which came from my Discord of like world builders and writers. They had some
Cool.
questions to throw in there.
Discord.
But so for publishing, I was curious because we talked about this a lot about the process of like publishing a magazine when we talked last time, Oliver. But what are like the differences between publishing a magazine versus publishing an anthology or just like a nonfiction book in general?
For an anthology,
Fiction book.
the reason I'm smiling and Jay started to laugh, I suspect, is because they know what I'm going to say. It's so much easier. Oh my god. Oh my god! The amount of times I may have mentioned a fellow by the name of Nathaniel Webb, who's kind of been my main collaborator, or at least certainly my first collaborator on the magazine. Right, he was the very first person I turned to and was like, "Want to do a magazine?" And he was like, "Yeah." And ever since the very beginning, like we were just like, I don't know, all we ever wanted to do was a magazine, so we did that. And then we got to this point early this year where I was like, "Okay, the anthology. Okay, we're gonna need." Well, we're not going to need 40 authors. We're going to need 6. Okay. And we're not going to need like 40 artists. We're going to need, well, 2 if we do have interior illustrations. That's a lot less emails to send. And like just like that, like very quotidian. I know, it's maybe not the most like creative answer, but I just like, and then Nathaniel's like, yeah, and then we sort of looked at each other, and I was like, dude, why did we start with the double black diamond of publishing? Like, why did we do this to ourselves? It's because we wanted to do it and we love it, but and
Right,
so it's just like,
passion.
yeah, but like it's just funny that I was like, oh, the anthology, it's like a little magazine with way less art and authors. Like that's exactly how I just thought about it. Now, not identical, but not completely off from what I'm saying. So in that sense, yeah, much simpler, which has been pleasing. Also, as we've discussed already for this, I was like, well, I'm going to try experimenting with somebody else doing the editing. And I'm pleased to report I'm not a complete control freak. Jay, I don't think you've suffered too much.
No.
It's true, I have a very specific vision of certain things, but actually, yeah, like it's hard to tell the story without. I'll just say this: there have been a couple of points where I was almost ready to be like, "Jay, I'm the publisher; I get final say on this," and then I would kind of pause, catch myself, and go, "Well, Oliver, if you're just going to steamroll over what Jay says, then why did you ask them to be the editor?" I've had to kind of level up as a publisher because of the magazine. I just was like, "I'm the publisher, I'm the editor, I'm doing everything." And it's been kind of fun to like force myself to like be a little more like, no, hang on. I brought Jay in. I got to trust not only Jay, but you have to trust your past self, right? In the sense of like, well, I chose to reach out to Jay, and it wasn't just about labor. It was about the fact that like I felt Jay understood, the kind of the other half of the Venn diagram overlap of what we're doing here, Romantasy and Sword Sorcery, way better than me, and amongst other bits of expertise that are useful. So like, trust yourself by trusting Jay was something I had to say to myself at a couple of key moments, and I'm really glad I did. It's turned out very well already. I've seen the results of that. So that's been interesting in terms of a difference for me, not being the whole sole like dictator of the project. And yeah, how is it going to go moving forward? Well, we'll see what happens. I mean, the crowdfund, I'm optimistic. It's funny though. I'll get into lost in numbers. We're asking for like way less money than the magazine, so that makes me tempted to be cocky. But the amount of backers we need is actually still relatively substantial because we're just selling one book. Like the magazine is fundamentally 2 books we're selling, and so that's twice as much money, more or less than like one backer getting one copy of this anthology. So there's a whole bunch of logistical challenges that are kind of intriguing. And like, while I do feel very confident, there's still that little voice in the back of my head that's like, oh, what if it doesn't work out? And because I haven't done this before, I haven't published an anthology before, I haven't published a book. that wasn't my own before. Yeah, like it's going to be interesting to see how all the little nitty gritty things I learn as I do it play out. And I'm looking forward to sitting down with my big notebook and writing things that I learn down afterwards. I always do that by hand. I find it just really useful. Like I basically just keep a publishing diary. And I
Yeah.
honestly like strongly encourage anybody who ever tries to do this to do that. Yeah, so I guess those are the main differences. Yeah, it's way simpler than a magazine. I don't want to say it's easy. I don't want to say like anybody could do it any day of the week. Well, anybody could try to do it. I mean, I'm stepping on my own words here. I'm trying to discourage anybody or
The other thing about
myself.
I was gonna say the other thing about a book is that it's a discrete object. If you
Yeah,
decide to never make another book, you don't have to.
yeah, that's true.
The
Right? The
magazine,
magazine, in
with a
theory, it's like
magazine,
it's
you
just
have at least
forever.
like an obligation to continuity or an obligation to discontinue it. But
Yeah,
with a book, you can decide what you like about doing a book and then do the next book or whatever comes after that.
yeah. I
Right.
mean,
You
if
have a
you
lot more flexibility there.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and also marketing is just easier because way more people talk about and read books than magazines. So,
Yeah.
which is a shame. More people should read magazines, but whatever. Yeah, I may or may not love books myself, obviously. So I'm fine with that. So yeah, there's just way more reviewers, way more people to get out to there. But again, it's all very quotidian publishing stuff. I feel bad that I haven't said anything about like a sorcerer or a sword in 5 minutes. I've just or a smooch.
It's
To
okay.
keep it
It's
keep
okay.
everything.
Oh, my swords aren't even in here. Oh, I was gonna say I could just like hold one for you just to like keep the vibe going strong.
Just like the closed caption, me talking about boring business stuff floating across the
It's just like
sword. Yeah.
Just a wall of numbers like the Matrix.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
There's like
But,
swords everywhere.
but yeah, no, I'm
Yeah.
excited because it really feels like the beginning of a journey. Like the magazine. If I only ever did the magazine, like the kind of numbers we'd have to move for me to make that what I do for a living would be bananas. But so for me, it's like I've been talking about. Let me put it this way. Aside from the fact that I hope that this book is the beginning of me moving towards making publishing what I do for a living, which I would love. I also see it as kind of like an experiment in something that will still be a lot of time and energy and new challenges. But as I mentioned earlier with the double black diamond thing, it's like the magazine is almost like a Lamborghini or some other like incredibly expensive, completely inefficient, beautiful to look at. Celebrities will stand beside it for 5 minutes. Like the magazine, I can get Michael Moorcock for a story, but I'll never get Michael Moorcock for a novel. And so, it's kind of fun, like in that way, right? Then
Mhm.
meanwhile, like books, it's like okay, like they're like the reliable like family sedan, which sounds unglamorous and unflattering, but hold it, that's what pays the bills for
Yeah.
GM Ford and all those guys, right? Or I
Mhm.
think about like TV, how like we all want to make like the next, whatever big prestige show, like Breaking Bad, bit of a data reference, I guess. But when you ever talk to anybody who like actually works in broadcasting, they're like, please get me the next cop show, please get me the next like hospital show, procedural show.
Right.
It's like you gotta. I'm losing myself in metaphor. I just
Get
uh,
away from
it's like I don't know. It's like it's simpler, but that doesn't mean that it's less interesting because it allows you to have a clear, focused hook, which I like.
Mhm.
The magazine has a lot going on and it's all very colorful, but then the book is kind of interesting that we can just hone in on this like specific romantasy sort of sorcery crossover thing, and I really dig
Mhm.
that. And I've already got plans for another book I want to try and crowdfund in the fall and stuff for next year, so we'll see where it all goes. But it all starts here with the anthology, so it's exciting that way as a beginning. Anyway, Jay, sorry to save me from
Oh
my
no.
own.
I just thought it was funny because it was like there's a very short answer and there's a very long answer and they're butting up against each other.
Well, we always know the one I'm going to go for. Jay, what would you say are the differences?
um So I mean, I don't have as much as it sounds like I have magic magazine experience. I don't have a lot of the actual like managing a magazine experience.
Mhm.
I have a lot of less reading magazine experience. I've been reading for a very long time for Uncanny Magazine as
Mhm.
a first reader there, and I've done some other editorial projects, but this is the first big project I've done for that, and so like transforming some of those skills of being able to like read a story and assess the like individual qualities for publishing is definitely like it's two different animals for a magazine versus an anthology, just because like the shape of the anthology is so much more precise
Mhm.
than the shape of a magazine you want like a different kind of spread, in my opinion. Like
Mhm.
a magazine is an invitation to a reader who's sort of like they're they're open to a lot more suggestion, where like if you're buying a book, you really want that book to be you want that book to be representative of the thing you thought it was when you bought it. Like that's the number
Right.
one review that nobody wants to get, is like, I bought this book thinking it was going to be one thing and it's a different thing. Like, so you have to really think about that when you're assessing a story and making it like, okay, so how does this shape fit with the shape next to it? And then how does the flow of that, like how does the flow of that story into the next story, like how can we balance those elements and make them really like shine? And also like honor and respect my authors too, because like it's their story. So like I have to really be particular about certain elements, and then also really like kind of advocate for what vision they brought to me, and be respectful of that. So it's been kind of a delightful adventure.
Yeah. So actually, like on that topic, because my next question was like specifically about like the editing process, right? So what was it like trying to get so many different pieces and so many different people together? Because I mean, I feel like there's a good number of writers that don't ever think about the concept of doing an anthology, and they're like, "Oh, that's so weird to think about." Trying to get all of that to work together and just coordinate all of that, like how does that even like work? Like not nitty gritty, right? Like you don't have to explain, well, I sent this email and this email, but like sure there's a lot of emails.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, honestly, like that's publishing in a nutshell if you want to know it. Like there's a lot of email involved. If you don't like email, this is not going to work well.
Fair.
In all seriousness though, the thing that actually worked really well for me, and I mean is actively working for me as we're refining all the bits and pieces, is we actually had different people working on different timelines. So we kind of had one set of stories coming in on one day and another set of stories coming in on another day, and that has actually made it much simpler for me to have not everybody all in my inbox at once. Honestly. And that was sort of like honestly just an accident of like the structure by which we had assembled the idea of doing this anthology was sort of like, all right, we reached out to a few people to sort of like figure out how this was going to go. And then until I had like a money green light, I was not really able to like reach out to some other people yet. So that was sort of like, so we had to kind of space those out just so that people would have enough time to write a story and they wouldn't just reject me because I can't write a story on that time. Like,
right.
we had to have a realistic deadline for everybody, and so spacing things out definitely was helpful for me.
Yeah, and this is where like relationships came in handy. You know, the authors I knew who had worked with me before or knew me very well were able to be like, okay, I've got faith in you. This will fund, you know. And so they were willing to start in their stories earlier. But the authors we didn't know, I was like, Jay, don't bug them until the magazine crowdfund succeeds or fails. Because if it fails, I'm not doing a book. So that kind of like forced it there. But yeah. It has been nice how it's worked out, being spread out that way. You know, even if it came out of again quotidian dollars and cents, it still ties into creative decisions and resources. You know, time and energy to put into it all, right? So it's all related. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Moving pieces.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like Jay, like, would you say like, you know, I know we're still kind of early on here, but it feels like to Madeline's question, like, have you ever been like giving notes so far on one of the manuscripts and thinking about how, well, this scene's a little too much like a scene in that story, you know, that I've also read of the six, or like any kind of nudges like that, or I mean, that's easy.
That is actually a thing I think about, and especially in this particular story. So like, on a previous project that I had worked on, like we were doing a kind of an open-ended thing that had a lot of very different genres kind of thrown at one like subject matter. And so this one is sort of the opposite of that, where like we have like kind of a few specific modes of story, and then like the variations are going to be what's coming from the author themselves, or like what is interesting them about the story, and then also like their unique take on like, here's how I'm going to build a world for this, or like that kind of thing. I don't want to spoil any elements yet, but there's definitely like I have two that are overlapping in a way that I think is really charming, and I'm trying to figure out exactly how I want to proceed with that, because it's an element that's like kind of unintentionally appeared in one story, and like or not unintentionally, but like one that the author did not tell me was coming, and I found very just sort of like, oh, that's very like it was surprising to me that that author arrived at the same sort of like background element that
Mm-hmm.
another story forefronts a little bit harder, but
Mm-hmm.
in a way that's different enough that I kind of think I'm going to be able to get away with it.
Yeah.
So I'm still sort of working on exactly what I want to say to those authors, just to sort of make sure that they differentiate themselves
Mm-hmm.
sufficiently that I don't get a lot of reviews going like, oh man, there's a lot of stories about blank in here. um I don't think we're gonna have that problem though.
With the
I feel like
magazine, I have
everybody
the
is
luxury.
writing. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, with the magazine, I have the luxury of sticking a story in another issue.
Yeah,
So I'm like, all
exactly.
right,
Yeah,
well,
no.
these two need to be separated.
This we just
Do
kind of
that.
have
The
to like.
anthology,
We
obviously,
have
you
a
can't.
lot of needles to thread at once, and
Mm-hmm.
so I still think they're going to produce things that are interesting and unique, and um, I'm I'm trying to think of a way to put it. Like, there's something about editing a short story in particular that's just like a short story is such a specific window into your characters, and so
Mm-hmm.
like you get such a narrow slice of who these people are trying to be, and who they're maybe not succeeding at being yet, and who they're, like, there's just like all of the promise and all of the hope and all of the fear is all in that one moment, that one story. And so even with characters that continue from story to story, like, which is really common in Sword and Sorcery, like the idea of the picaresque, where like you have like Fritz Leiber classically did all of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories and stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
where you have like continuity to an extent, and an expectation of like certain kind of like wavelength boundaries. But um with short stories now, and especially in this, like there's a couple of characters that are recurring from another story, but for the most part we're working with new characters. And so there's just like there's so much hope in one little box, and you have to kind of like meet it out very, very carefully.
Yeah, that's fair. Thank you for watching, and remember there is going to be a part 2 where we are going to talk about questions relating to romantasy, or the romance genre, with fantasy, and the sword and sorcery genre, and ways to combine them, and talking about tropes and all that sort of fun stuff. And then we're going to be talking about some advice for writers in general, and it's going to be a great time, so keep an eye out for that video when it goes live, and I will see you in the next one.